Today's lecture is about debating topicality. We'll talk about the argument of topicality, what it is, its strategic function in debate. We'll talk a little bit about executing the strategy from the negative side, how we need to structure the strategy. We'll talk about affirmative responses to topicality, and then if time, we'll talk a little bit about topicality arguments on this topic in particular. So what is topicality sort of at its baseline level? It is an argument about whether or not the plan fits within the contours of the resolution. So topicality is an argument about what the plan does, primarily. It is not about what the advantages say. It's not necessarily about what solvency evidence says. It's about what the plan does, what the plan text says. And today we are primarily going to be talking about debating topicality in a debate where both teams agree that the resolution defines the affirmative's burden of proof. So we're not going to talk so much about what happens when the affirmative decides to critique the notion of topicality or being topical. There will be plenty of other lectures about that here. We're primarily going to be talking about topicality where both teams are providing interpretations of the topic and believe that the resolution defines the affirmative's burden of proof. So I will now address a couple kind of derivations of the argument topicality and some vocabulary that I'm sure you've heard before in some respects. So extra topicality and effects topicality. Extra topicality defines the situation where some aspects of the affirmative plan are topical, do fit within the contours of the resolution, and some aspects of the affirmative plan do not fit within the contours of the resolution. So you might have an affirmative that strengthens intellectual property rights and then also gives universal health care. That would be extra topical. It would, in some part, fit within the contours of the resolution and then exceed those contours with the non-topical components. And then the second vocabulary term is effects topicality. So this is the argument that the affirmative is only topical after the process of solvency, so only after the plan has been implemented and has done some things does it end up strengthening intellectual property protection, only by effect or result, not by the mandate of the plan. Now, effects topicality functions in a bit of an interesting way on this topic because the phrase for what a topical affirmative is here is an affirmative that strengthens protection of intellectual property rights. Well, the question of strength and protection might very well be in and of itself an effects question. So, we might not be able to figure out whether or not an affirmative strengthens protection without looking at the effect of the plan. And so I think that's something to keep in mind as you're going about debating the question of topicality. The other thing that I'd like to note about extra topicality and effects topicality, to me, these are not separate arguments. These are not like distant cousins of topicality. These are simply ways of explaining that the affirmative is not topical. So these are just topicality arguments, but there's a vocabulary to describe the ways in which that they are not topical. So from a strategic perspective, on both the affirmative side and the negative side, topicality is all about limits. Topicality is all about what does the topic look like for debate under the world of the interpretation. It is about providing the best limit and the best contour for debate. Topicality is fundamentally debate is fundamentally a research-centered activity. That is what we do, right? And so in order to craft a topic that is good and fruitful for debates, we need well-defined, well-contoured limits on that topic. And so most of the arguments that we might currently think of as other standards, right, or sort of separate standards from limits on topicality, in my eyes, are really about limits, right? They are about how do we decide what the best limit on the topic is. Take predictability, for example. Predictability is not just sort of a good in and of itself, like, okay, we've got, the most ordinary meaning, dictionary definition of the words on the topic. That's not an independent reason why one side should or should not win a topicality debate. Predictability is good if it defines a predictable set of limits for the topic, a predictable locus for preparation for both sides, okay? Think about the question of ground, right? You'll see a lot of teams on Topicality say that Topicality is a voting issue for ground, right? The negative does not have stuff to say. Well, in reality, the negative always has some things to say. They can always go for some critique argument. They can always go for some process counterplan. It is never true that the negative does not have ground. However, sometimes the negative does not have the best ground that leads to good substantive debate under particular limits of the topic, right? So ground, once again, is an argument about qualifying the limits to the topic and describing why your limit on the topic is better than their limit on the topic, vis-a-vis the availability of good substantive disadvantages that the negative might have. Similarly, you'll see some people make arguments about topic education or education in the direction of kind of different things that people would like to learn about vis-a-vis the topic. This is an argument that is not as important as the question of limits. You are always going to learn about the topic, sort of regardless of how we are defining the contours of the topic, but defining those contours is really important for research, and that component is what drives the incentives to learn and get educated about the topic. So it's all about research and all about defining the contours of the topic. Additionally, some folks will make arguments about framers' intent. So the framers are the folks who write the resolutional wording proposals and present them to the board of high school debates, and then it gets voted on. And sometimes people will make arguments about how they intended the topic to be described. Once again, this is better utilized as an argument about what should the contours of the topic be, what should the limit of the topic be, because that is how we define the ground of both sides and the research that both teams do before the debate starts and even before the tournament starts. So we'll talk a little bit about just the parts of the 1 and C and about how to kind of create a topicality argument and structure a topicality argument throughout the debate. So the first part of the 1 and C is the interpretation. And we all know this, we are presenting an interpretation of the words in the resolution. Words have multiple meanings, basically all of them. The words that are utilized in the resolution also have multiple meanings. So strengthen does not just mean one thing. If you opened up a dictionary definition for the word strengthen or the word protection, you're going to find A, B, and C. You're going to see 3 different meanings probably. And so when we're undergoing the process of topicality, we are arguing that one way of interpreting this word is better than a different way of interpreting interpreting that same word for debate. Better for debate, for defining the contours of the resolution. What makes an interpretation good? Well, good interpretations are qualified, right? Typically, a good interpretation is written by someone who knows something about the word that they're talking about. Maybe they have some legal expertise, or they're a dictionary themselves and they're in the business of defining words, right? So you want qualified definitions from folks who are setting out to define those words. Field context is particularly important, right? So you want people who are defining the words in the resolution within the context of intellectual property rights. That is going to be a lot better than a card that is defining the word protection outside of the context of intellectual property rights or in another context. The other side of field context is this idea of ordinary meaning. So there are some people that think that, and frankly some people in the legal field that think that the best way to define words and the best way to understand what words mean is by looking at their plain and ordinary meaning. How do we use that word in plain language? What do we mean by strength and protection when the average Joe says that to one another? And typically, the process of finding ordinary meaning means going to core dictionary definitions that a lot of people read, right? So Merriam-Webster's, words and phrases, those sorts of dictionary definitions are how we might find and search for ordinary meaning. And so there's these are kind of opposite sides of the coin. So field context within the context of intellectual property and plain and ordinary meaning. Good interpretations have intent to define. So good interpretations go about trying to tell you what the word means, right? So a good interpretation card does not just kind of offhandedly say strength and protection. It says to strengthen protection means X. The best interpretation cards that you read in Topicality are cards that go about trying to and intending to define the words in the resolution. Intent to distinguish or exclude. So a good interpretation card is going to intend not just to tell you what the word means, but also tell you what the word does not mean, right? So strength and protection means X, it does not mean Y. Those interpretation cards are very, very useful because they help you establish clear violations and clear reasons why the affirmative might not meet that interpretation, because you have both what does it mean as well as what it does not mean. The last is a little bit of an aside, but good interpretations are grammatically correct. So you want folks who are using the words in the resolution sort of in the right order, within the right conjugation, right? So you want to make sure that it's within the same grammatical context as it is within the resolution. I also want to give a little bit of an aside on the question of legal context, right? So when I see topicality debates, I often see teams trying to make a big deal about situations where either they are reading cards from judges who are defining words, or they're reading cards from law review articles who are defining words, and they'll say, well, it comes from the field of law, therefore it is much more qualified. I think that at times, legal context can be an argument about why your interpretation is qualified. So if your interpretation does come from a judge in a case, that can be really qualified, especially if the case is about what does the word mean, which many legal cases are. However, I think that you always want to set the question of legal context also within the question of field context, right? So oftentimes what judges are doing or what lawyers are doing is they're interpreting statutes and what words mean in the context of those statutes. And so I often see people they'll read cards that say strengthen means X in the context of a gun control statute. And it's like, okay, well, that's got nothing to do with intellectual property rights. But then, the tag will also say legal context. We have the most qualified legal context card. It's like, well, that doesn't really matter because it's not within the context of the field of intellectual property rights. And those same people, those same judges and lawyers might view what that word means very differently within the context of another body of law, right? So in my mind, field context is a lot more important than legal context, even though legal context is something you should talk about when you're talking about the question of qualification for interpretations. A good one in C also has a violation. You need to explain in plain language and clear words why the affirmative does not meet your interpretation. Oftentimes, I see people sort of take this step assumed, and they either skip the violation step or they have some kind of boilerplate language. The better you are able to concretely describe what the violation is in the one in C, the more serious your argument is going to end up being. The next step is the standards, the reasons to prefer your interpretation. So the gold standard, of course, is limits, right? You want to say that you provide the interpretation that provides the best limit on the topic. What makes a limit good? Well, one, good limits are predictable limits. They are not arbitrarily chosen. They are chosen by interpretations that are well-grounded in the literature, that have intent to define, that are qualified, et cetera, et cetera. Good interpretations good limits arguments have clear, bright line for what does or does not fit within the limit. This goes along with the intent to distinguish or intent to exclude question, but you want to have a very clear answer to the question of what affirmatives are or are not topical within your limit on the topic. Good limits strike the balance between under-limiting and over-limiting. Hopefully they don't do either. So to define some vocabulary here, under-limiting means interpretations that provide too small of a limit on the topic. There are too many affirmatives, too many examples of topical action that fit within that vision of the topic, that it makes research for the negative side particularly difficult. Over-limiting is the other side. The cap on the topic is too small to provide good research incentives for the affirmative side, and debates become small and stale. Good limits strike the balance between under-limiting and over-limiting. This is where case lists come into play. So with case lists, you want to clearly, succinctly, and concretely define to the judge what sets of affirmatives are topical under your interpretation and what sets of affirmatives are added under their interpretation. So you want to be very clear about what it is that has changed between the interpretations. So case lists are very useful for describing your internal link to limits, right? Just how under-limited is the affirmative's interpretation. You want to think a little bit about stepping back and thinking about what changes when the topic becomes a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. And this, I think, is the most important intellectual exercise for thinking about quote-unquote terminal impacts to topicality, or how do your limits arguments relate to questions of education and questions of fairness. So you want to think for yourself about, okay, what happens when the topic increases by 20 affirmatives? That is 20 more affirmatives that now the negative has to sit down and write case negs for. That's a fairly burdensome activity, right? We're doing our very, very best to write case negs to, roughly 12 affirmatives that have been put out by this camp. That's burdensome for us. Imagine if we added like another 35 affirmatives on top of that. That's a very difficult task for the negative to go about doing. So what are they going to do? Well, they're probably going to write case negs that are comparatively thinner. They're probably going to try to make their generic arguments retrofit and work in those debates. And they're going to have strategies that are not particularly case specific and that are more kind of generic. Probably they're going to go for process counter plans or generic critique arguments more, right? And those debates, I would say, are comparatively thinner than the debates that we have where the negative has researched case-specific strategies and are able to debate the case in depth. So the negative wants to draw some of this stuff out, right? We get less clash in a world of an under-limited topic because our research burden becomes so large that we are unable to rigorously prepare specific strategies to different affirmatives. And the negative also wants to say that the affirmative's incentives, or the incentives for affirmative research, are really good under their topic too, right? Smaller topics mean that the affirmative is now researching answers to case-specific strategies that the negative has cut. It means that affirmatives are pressed to write new advantages and do a lot of in-depth research about their affirmative because they can't just go ditch their affirmative and write a new affirmative on the edge of the topic, right? So you want to think about describing the world in which the topic is a little bit smaller in ways that might seem desirable for the judge or seem desirable for debate. On the other side, right, if you're putting your affirmative hats on, you want to think about describing what happens in a world where the topic is over-limited in ways that might seem bad or derogatory for debate. So in a world where the affirmative is sort of, we're trapped within the confines of reading 12 to 15 affirmatives. We don't have a lot of flexibility. There are only so many topical affirmative cases. that means that we're always going to face the loaded gun of the negative, right? We're going to face, 9 off good arguments, case-specific strategies, along with all the generic arguments and the process counterplans and the critiques, right? We're going to debate all of that stuff too, and we're just going to have no chance because the negative's going to be so ahead of the game, and debate's going to start to get a little bit stale and a little bit boring, and it's going to be less fresh and new because the affirmative is not able to introduce new content that makes the debate fresh and exciting. And the affirmative needs the flexibility to innovate, to craft new arguments, to cut some cards about new affirmatives. That is a particularly important component of debate that makes topics good and interesting. So on both sides, when we're describing the terminal impact of topicality, or how does this question of what are our limits or what are good contours of the topic, how does that relate to terminal impact questions of fairness and education, we're thinking about describing the world in which the interpretation has been universalized and describing what that looks like for debate. The other way that I think you can do this is by qualifying what has changed about the topic between your interpretation and their interpretation. So not just how many AFs have been introduced in their interpretation, but what kinds of AFs and how are those AFs debated. And this is where you can start to get as sort of specific as possible to your interpretation arguments. So for example, if you say that strengthening intellectual property protection means adding new subject matter to copyrights, patents, or trademarks, it does not mean strengthening the enforcement of currently held intellectual property, you would say the interpretation that the AF will present, which is that they can strengthen enforcement, creates a set of affirmatives that are very difficult to derive disadvantages with link uniqueness to, right? So you can get really specific in terms of qualifying what has changed or what the difference is between your limits and their limits by describing what kinds of AFs are allowed and whether those AFs are good or bad for debate. This is where negative ground arguments come in, right? I don't view negative ground arguments as sort of super persuasive separate standards, but I think that they are really useful in terms of qualifying the difference between your interpretation and their interpretation, because they can tell the judge, okay, not just are we faced with this massive research burden and we have to go home and we have to cut all these case negs and that's like really hard and we're going to have really thin debates and a rush to generics, but also we're going to have a bunch of debates about a section of AFs that don't have negs to them, and that's not going to lead to a really fruitful topic that's going to weigh the direction of the competitive equities too far in the direction of the affirmative. It is unfair for the negative to vote for that vision of the topic, right? So really think hard about the difference between the world of your interpretation and the world of their interpretation, and describing that difference as something that is bad if you're the negative and good if you're the affirmative. So, the block. A common question that I get is, how long should topicality be extended in the block? The question depends on a number of factors, including the quality of your topicality argument and how does topicality fit within the confines of the other arguments in the negative block. So if topicality is your A strat, so topicality is the thing that you want to go for in the 2 and R, you think that the affirmative is not topical. I think that it is absolutely appropriate to give like a full 5 minutes of either the 2 and C or just all of the 1 and R that is entirely about topicality. Some of the best debates that I've judged on topicality have included long time commitment in the block on the question of topicality. I judged a debate between Michigan and Harvard in the octafinals of Wake last year, where Harvard was going for topicality. The block split was the 2 and C was a process counterplan, and the 1 and R was 6 minutes of topicality. And I thought that that was a brilliant block split because Harvard wins the spade on topicality. And they really were able to develop their topicality argument in the block because they heavily invested in topicality from a time perspective. So if you're going into a debate where you think you are absolutely ending this debate in the 2&R on the question of topicality, I think like at least 4 minutes of time commitment in the negative block is appropriate. It can be in the 2&C, it can be in the 1&R, both are fine, but I think that you do want heavy time investment in that world. There are other worlds where topicality is not the A strategy for the 2&R. Maybe topicality is your B or C strategy, but you think it's good to have some kind of insulated offense or a one-page 2&R that you can give in the block. In those situations, I think relatively 3 minutes is kind of my minimum for how long it takes to credibly extend topicality. You know, you can sort of shadow extend topicality in 2 minutes if you like really want to, but it's not going to be a credible option. The 1AR is not going to have to spend a lot of time on it. And so I think that 3 minutes in situations where topicality is a lower priority 2&R strategy, and at least 4 minutes in worlds where topicality is the primary 2&R strategy would be my recommendation for time commitment in the negative block. You want to be very careful about making sure you're good on the line by line in the negative block, right? So 2ACs are going to drop, well, 2ACs are going to make a lot of these kind of small arguments within the 2AC, right? Functional limits, predictability, precision, we're always going to lose to this kind of counter plan, right? They're going to sort of throw out a lot of arguments about topicality, and making sure that you're good on the line by line and answering every single one of those arguments is particularly important. Make sure that you are prioritizing your offense and you're not missing any of the components of this, right? So you're making an underlimiting argument. You're talking about why underlimiting is bad for debate. You have a case list that describes what affirmatives are added to the topic by their interpretation. You have a case list that talks about what affirmatives are still topical under your interpretation that are good for debate. Don't miss any of these components if you really want to go for topicality. Make sure all of those components are present in the negative block if you really want to go for topicality. 2&R, I'm sure you've heard this advice before, but it's all or nothing, right? You are either only going for topicality for the entirety of the 5 minutes of your 2&R, or you are not going for topicality. Even if you think, oh, it's like a 1 minute TKO. Nope, you're only going for topicality if you're going for topicality. In the rare situation where the other team has dropped the argument of topicality, go for topicality as long as you need to explain it and sit down. That's a very rare kind of edge case situation, but still only topicality in the 2&R, no other arguments. All right, that's negative side. I'll stop for questions about executing the argument of topicality, envisioning the argument of topicality on the next side. Thaddeus.
So when you're talking about like how on this topic the like strengthening kind of begs the question of like effects T, like there's obviously like some sort of distinction between apps that like have a really long internal link chain towards protecting IP, and then apps that are like still technically effects T because it begs the question of solvency, but it's closed. How do you like draw that distinction kind of as the negative?
So I think the way I would say it is you would say, so topicality is still a question of the mandates of the plan text, right? So does the plan text mandate strengthening protection? And, you know, let's say, for example, these apps that like make injunctions stronger or something, like that strengthens the remedy, maybe that effectually strengthens protection. And the app that, you know, is more the like butterfly effect app where it's like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, then strengthens protection. That's a fundamentally different thing because we're still talking about what does the plan text mandate, right? Does the plan text mandate something that interacts with intellectual property law in a way that strengthens protection? I think that's the way I would describe that particular difference.
So in that scenario, like case lists sort of be like injunctions, so like any apps that are specific to like what's one component of patent protection or something that you're increasing, or like copyright litigation, and then like you're limiting out anything that doesn't explicitly call that out, or like how would you structure a case list?
Yeah, so I think, and again, a lot of this has to do with the set of cards that you're reading, but I think in that world, you're reading the set of cards that are just like that say strengthening protection is inclusive of increased enforcement, and you're reading the cards that use strengthening remedies as an example, or like enhancing remedies as an example of that. And so you're saying, okay, we have read, we're well grounded in literature what strengthened protection means. It includes increased remedies. It includes making it easier to find out who's infringing on the patent, copyright, trademark, etc. It does not include whatever the act is about, right? So it's about the sort of the cards that you're reading and about how you're describing and interpreting what the topic means in that way. Yeah.
So if like you had a 1 on CT violation that like a standard was like extra keys and independent voting issue, could you go for that for like a part of the 2-1R? Or like would you still have to like spend all 5 minutes?
Okay, so in my mind, and again, I'm not the only person who has thoughts about this, and other people disagree. I don't think extra topicality is an independent voting issue. I think extra topicality is a description of the violation, right? So extra topicality says this app violates because while it may include some topical components, it also includes not topical components. And our argument is that we should exclude those non-topical components. And so you're still in the world of winning that the interpretation which excludes those non-topical components is a good interpretation for debate and a good limit for debate, right? So I don't think extra topicality or affects topicality is an independent, external, isolated question. It is just a description of the violation of the debate, and you're just sort of back to the regular standards questions. Yeah.
One question outside of the feeling, in terms of this topic, terms of really like great at really defining terms and excluding them. So I guess how do you think the negative should phrase the limits push in response to an affirmative argument that's like predictability outweighs, like the most predictable evidence is the only thing that matters because limits is fake or whatever. How do you think the negative should go out?
So I think that for this one, you want to just be like really big on debatability is the most important question of topicality. We are primarily setting limits that are best for debate and best for negative preparation. And so we should not throw out the task of trying to set about an interpretation that provides a good balance between affirmative and negative competitive equity because of the way the resolution was written or because of, quote unquote, more predictable definitions that one side may have or may not have. The other argument that I like and that I've seen made before is the argument that through the process of topicality debating, debatable interpretations can become predictable. So as a particular interpretation wins multiple debates, it can then be kind of embedded in debate community norms and can become a predictable interpretation, at least for our context as debaters, through the process of topicality debating. And so you should say, that the judge should vote for your debatable interpretation in the process of trying to build consensus for that interpretation because it's a really good interpretation for debate vis-a-vis their interpretation. The other part of this that I think is important is you always want to push back on notions of predictability or precision in terms of the AF saying that they sort of they're the only team that gets to access that, right? You want to say, what is the bright line for predictability? What makes an interpretation precise? So I see a lot of debates where the affirmative team says, vote for us, we have the most precise definition. And the AF says, well, our definition's kind of precise too. And I end the debate by going, well, I don't really know, I can't really vote for the affirmative team with, because they're saying precision's the most important thing, but also, I don't know if they're that much more precise than the other side, right? So you always want to test the link to that question. So, and that's about drawing out the debate about the interpretation, drawing out these questions of qualification, intent to define, intent to exclude, et cetera. And I think that's the way you deal with big precision or predictability pushes. Okay, let's put our AF hats on. So we're still talking about limits, but just in some different ways, right? So we're not saying that we're trying to make the topic super small, like the negative is saying. We're saying that we want to create good limits for debate that are still grounded in predictable literature, that still set clear, bright lines on what is or is not topical, but we're often using the language of affirmative innovation. So we're saying that we want topics that are maybe a little bit larger than the negative ones because it provides flexibility for the affirmative to research and for the affirmative to try to create new affirmatives that have new angles against common negative positions, right? So you're saying we do not want debate to be stale, to be about a few Fs. We want debate to be fresh and new, and there should be room, particularly when we get towards the end of the season and we get to like the TOC and NDCA, the affirmative should be able to write new affirmatives that are interesting takes on the topic that have not been read before, because we kind of want the sense that the topic is developing, that the topic is growing, that we're not having the exact same debates at the TOC that we had at camp, right? Because we're developing our ideas about what the topic is, and the affirmative is innovating in response to negative arguments. So we're still talking about what good limits are, but we're saying we have better predictable limits, and our limit is better for affirmative innovation because it's a little bit bigger. So components of a 2AC, you're always making a we meet argument, whether or not you sort of can objectively prove that you meet the interpretation. You're always pressing the violation, right? This is link defense to the violation. So you're always making a we meet push. You always, always, always have a counter interpretation. And you want to make sure that you're counter interpreting and counter defining every single word that the negative has interpreted or that the negative has defined. So if the negative's topicality violation defines 3 words, it defines strengthen, it defines protection, it also defines like patents, you also want to have counter interpretations of strengthen, protection, and patents. So you want to make sure that you're not missing a word that the 1 in C is defined that can serve as kind of an independent violation. You want to make sure you're counter-interpreting and counter-defining every word that the negative has defined. You have your standards for yourself, right? So you're going to have your arguments about predictability, your arguments about precision, your arguments about F innovation. You're going to say that the negative's interpretation over limits, right? It creates a too burdensome limit on the topic for the affirmative. You're probably going to make some arbitrariness arguments. So you're going to say that, and this is sort of part and parcel of the predictability debate, but this is sort of the offensive phrasing of it. You're going to say they have arbitrarily picked a definition that excludes our affirmative, right? That is not very qualified, not very predictable. You're going to say that there are functional limits on the topic, meaning that there are generic arguments that prevent the sort of endless proliferation of tiny Fs that the negative is trying to kind of present as their limits argument, right? So obviously not every affirmative case has a solvency advocate, not every affirmative case has good advantages. Some of them should just like instantly lose to politics, or some of them don't have solvency deficits to sui generis, right? So you want to talk about that as a reason why your interpretation still provides a good and debatable limit on the topic, because there are functional limits that prevent the under-limiting explosion, but their interpretation is arbitrary and prevents us from exploring new and innovative arguments on the affirmative side. So my thesis on the affirmative is you always want to sort of focus your argument on AF innovation and AF research. So you want the 2AR to be about AF innovation and AF research under your limit of the topic. You want to say that their topic is unfair because it does not, it makes stale debate. It means that the affirmative runs into the loaded gun of the negative. And then the affirmative always wants to make a reasonability argument. So reasonability is the argument that we should debate about good interpretations of the topic and interpretations of the topic that are predictable, right, that we can find out before the tournament, rather than sort of searching for the smallest and the sort of optimal limit of the topic. Because if we think about it, it is possible that if we lose this debate, the negative reads an interpretation that excludes our affirmative, the affirmative loses that debate, and then they change their affirmative to an affirmative that meets that interpretation of strength and protection, and then the negative reads an even smaller interpretation of strength and protection and wins that debate because small topics are good, right? So reasonability is hedging back against this idea of small topics for small topics' sake, or limits for the sake of limits, right? You're saying that debate should not pursue that idea. Instead, debate should say, if your topic is good enough to facilitate substantive debates, then we should not have these endless debates about topicality, because voting for topicality creates an incentive structure. Voting for topicality in debates where the affirmative is reasonable creates an incentive structure where the negative is going to kind of endlessly have an interpretation that kind of excludes our affirmative. It makes the topic a little bit smaller, and that means we never get to talk about the substance of the affirmative. So substance crowd out is a critical component to a reasonability argument. How does the negative team address reasonability arguments? Well, you want to say that the question of whether an interpretation is good enough or is reasonable is fundamentally an arbitrary question, and one that encourages judges to sort of intervene and vote on their ideas of kind of what a reasonable or good enough topic is. And that instead, we should have an incentive structure where the debaters themselves determine what the topic means through research, right? So competing interpretations encourages debaters to do T-research, right? We have to cut cards that define and interpret the topic, and that is a much better way, and then we have debates about whether those interpretations are good or bad, and that's a much better way to define the scope of the topic than the question of reasonability. You should also say that, the standards arguments and your limits arguments proves that they are not a reasonable interpretation of the argument of the topic. And you should say that the combination of all possible reasonable interpretations of the topic is an unreasonable vision of the topic. Questions about affirmative answers or negative responses to affirmative answers? Yeah.
So, like, if you're reading like a creatively topical KF, like a self-left app, does that change how you answer topicality? Like, not like a critique of topicality, but like, could you make different education arguments about like the stuff you're talking about?
You can make different education arguments. The vulnerability of those education arguments is debate key to those education arguments, right? So the negative team is going to say that those education arguments are not like, you don't need to debate about the 1AC to get to those education arguments. You can sort of research that on your own time. You can read a book about it. They're going to sort of make these arguments about whether debate is key to that, because their argument is going to be the sort of unique thing that makes debate good is that we get to clash, and we get research that is predicated on the question of clash and the question of sort of debating well-researched negative, and the affirmative sort of modifying and changing their answers based on well-researched negative. And so they're going to test the question of whether debate is key to those education arguments. You certainly would make education arguments, and sometimes you might make arguments that are a little bit critical at the level of the interpretation, right? So, you're not critiquing the notion of topicality, but you're certainly free to critique an interpretation of the topic as a way to sort of bolster your interpretation of the topic. That's a way I've seen some teams who are deploying strategies like that have made those arguments as well. Yeah.
So, do you kind of feel like, because some judges feel like there needs to be some more like terminal impact rather than just like a description of like what research and what debates look like under an interpretation. But do you just think that it's sufficient to describe like what research and what debates under your look like as like kind of often sort of like impact to your
So when you're describing what research and what affirmatives occur under your interpretation of debate, you're describing your interpretation is good for debate and their interpretation is bad for debate. That aspect is the terminal impact, right? So you need that portion of it. So you need to say, so it's not like you need terminal impacts in the same way that you want like framework style terminal impacts where you're giving like a soliloquy about clash, but you do want to make the argument of like smaller topics mean there are, more limited topics means there's better clash because there are these research incentives. Under limited topics means there's, qualitatively less clash. It's worse for debate. If you're using the language of worse for debate, I think that you're getting to some terminal impacty kind of language that is useful. So I think that there's maybe a bit of a middle ground there, where it's like you do want to talk about the relationship between your limits arguments and the notion of clash, the notion of fairness in education. You don't need to spend 3 minutes of your 2NR talking about why fairness is an impact, right? Because we're not sort of in that kind of debate, but we do want to talk about why our interpretation is good for debate relative to their interpretation in ways that are relevant for fairness in education. Other questions?